The scene at Boston Logan International Airport that morning was no different from any other day. People hurriedly moved about, luggage wheels rolling across the polished floor, and the constant hum of announcements filling the air. Everything seemed to flow in harmony like a bustling symphony of life. But for David Morgan and Ethan Morgan, this flight held special significance. David, an African-American man, was a self-made billionaire, the founder of one of the largest tech companies in the United States. A well-known philanthropist, he had used much of his wealth to serve the community and assist the less fortunate. His position of power came not only from his successful career, but also from his profound contributions to society. Ethan, David's 17-year-old son, a talented young man with impressive achievements, was about to embark on a new chapter in his life. He had just received a full scholarship to MIT, one of the world's top universities. This was a well-deserved reward for his tireless efforts over the past few years. Today, for the first time in his life, Ethan was enjoying the luxury of sitting in first class on a long flight, a gift from his father. For them, this flight was not just a journey to San Francisco, but a monumental event marking the success of a new generation in the Morgan family. While the other passengers around them continued with their routines, a quiet transformation was taking place between the two, with silent joy about the future. David looked at his son, a warm smile on his face, wanting to share his pride. "You've done great, Ethan," he said, his voice deep and full of pride. "You've made it here on your own. And today, we'll enjoy the fruits of your labor," Ethan, with a look filled with respect for his father, responded with a rare smile. Though only 17, he understood the value of the sacrifices his father had made for the family. This was not just an ordinary flight. It was proof of the relentless efforts both father and son had made in life. As they boarded the plane, the flight attendant greeted them with a friendly smile. Ethan couldn't help but be fascinated by the luxurious space in first class, where every detail from the seats to the lighting was designed to provide maximum comfort. Everything seemed to reflect what David had built, a life full of success and prosperity. However, not all passengers on this flight shared the same perspective. Dr. Walter Schilling, a renowned cardiologist, sat in the front row by the aisle, near where David and Ethan were seated. Although Dr. Schilling was not a person of great societal power, he felt himself to be someone with significant influence. With his achievements in medicine and the respect he commanded from his peers, he considered himself an important figure in society. As the flight was about to take off, Dr. Schilling's cold stare suddenly shifted toward David and his son. He looked at them from above, his face displaying an unmistakable air of disdain. David didn't notice the look, continuing his conversation with his son. But Ethan, though just 17, sensed the stare and felt a rising discomfort in his chest. The flight began to take off, and the atmosphere in first class grew warmer. Casual conversations began to fill the space, but for Dr. Schilling, the frustration seemed unrelenting. The more he looked toward David and his son, the more uncomfortable he became. An unfamiliar feeling rose within him, envy toward those who lived a life he thought was beyond his reach, despite dedicating his life to medicine. At that moment, Diana, the flight attendant serving first class, approached Dr. Schilling to inquire about his drink preferences. While Diana was serving him, a brief conversation ensued, but everything was far from simple. Dr. Schilling's discomfort only grew. The issue was not just Diana's perceived rudeness in serving him, but the contempt he felt toward those sitting around him, particularly those he thought didn't deserve to be there. Ethan, sitting next to his father, felt an unease in the air. He realized that this flight, though meant to be a simple reward for his efforts, was slowly turning into an unwanted mental battle. And here, in the first-class cabin, a silent confrontation was beginning to take shape. Little did anyone know, in just a few minutes, this flight would become the starting point of a story no one on board would ever forget. A story not only about racism, but also about power, patience, and the values that people choose to protect in today's world. The feeling on Flight 237 had become different, not only for Ethan but for every passenger in first class. The atmosphere in the cabin was enveloped in an unfamiliar tension, a kind of unease that no one could touch. As the plane began to climb away from the skies of Boston, everything seemed to blur in Marcus' view. He looked out the window, where the deep blue sky reflected the golden light of the rising sun. But his heart was heavy with indescribable emotions. Beside him, David, his father, sat quietly, his gaze calm as always, as if there to guide the path ahead. Many times, Ethan had wondered if he could ever be like his father, a man who always maintained composure when everything around seemed to be in turmoil. But today, Ethan couldn't help but feel the difference between himself and the other passengers. The presence of his father, along with the accomplishments his father had achieved, created a unique space around them. This was not just the first-class cabin of a commercial flight, but a small world where the division between social classes was sometimes only an invisible wave, unnoticed by most. Just ahead of them, Dr. Schilling, the renowned cardiologist, sat there, his cold eyes scanning everyone. A man with an impressive career, yet it seemed he lacked a very important quality: respect for others. A man who, though unspoken, clearly displayed an air of superiority in how he viewed those around him. Ethan felt this from the moment he met him. As Dr. Schilling's gaze swept over him and his father before lingering coldly, it didn't just make him feel ignored, it left a subtle unease filling the space around them. "Dad, is he always like that?" Ethan finally asked, knowing the answer wouldn't be easy. David smiled lightly and shook his head. "Don't worry about him. That's life. Sometimes people just see what they want to see. What matters is how we see ourselves." His voice was firm as always, but today, Ethan could sense a hint of sadness in his father's eyes. It seemed David knew that, no matter how many challenges they overcame, people like Dr. Schilling would always exist somewhere in this world. The flight continued under a tense atmosphere. Passengers began to settle into their lunch, but Dr. Schilling, still muttering in discomfort over the warmth in the cabin, only made the atmosphere heavier. He kept complaining about the service, even though everything was perfect. One of the flight attendants, Diana, passed by and gently asked, "Would you like some more cold water, sir?" Dr. Schilling looked at her with almost a sneer, then responded bitterly, "This is probably too much for me." His voice was cold, showing no attempt to hide his disrespect. Marcus listened, feeling uncomfortable, but he didn't react. Instead, he looked to his father for guidance. David gently placed his hand on his, as if to tell him to remain calm, but it wasn't easy. Every word from Dr. Schilling felt like invisible arrows piercing Ethan's heart. The constant feeling of being belittled pushed him into a state of unease. Though he was sitting in first class, though he and his father both deserved to be there, Dr. Schilling's attitude made him feel like he didn't belong. A kind of discrimination that was unspoken yet so obvious it could not be denied. What would happen if people like Dr. Schilling always existed and continued to behave this way in a world where fairness and human dignity needed to be respected more than ever? Ethan wondered, but quickly pushed the thought aside. He couldn't let it affect him. He looked up and saw his father sitting up straighter, his eyes no longer gentle, but sharper. It seemed David had read the thoughts in his mind. "You know, Ethan," David said gently, but each word was sure and steady, "when someone like Dr. Schilling looks at us like that, it's just a lesson to help us understand that we will never allow anyone else to judge us or make us feel inferior. All we need to do is stay on course." That was when Ethan understood. His father wasn't just teaching him how to live in society as a successful person, but also how to face the challenges life presents. And this time, life had brought him a significant challenge: to confront racism and disdain from people he never expected. The story, though quiet and unassuming, was a moment Ethan would always remember. For in this first-class cabin, it wasn't just a divide between the wealthy and the ordinary, but a divide in the perception of human value. And as David had said, the only way to face it was not to let it affect the path you walk. The tension in the first-class cabin slowly began to ease, but no one knew that the story wouldn't end here. This discrimination wouldn't just be resolved in the silence of those witnessing it would soon be brought to light. Dr. Schilling still kept up his attitude with all the passengers around him, but at this moment, the event he could not foresee was beginning to unfold. Everything would change, and his behavior would have consequences that no one in this first-class cabin could predict. Flight 237 continued to glide through the floating clouds, carrying with it a strange, elusive feeling. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere seemed to be dominated by an unexplainable tension. While everything was still proceeding as usual, beneath the surface of calm, a small storm had quietly formed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't hasty, but everyone could feel that something was off, and that something was Dr. Schilling. Ethan couldn't help but notice Dr. Schilling's gaze, which no longer pretended to be polite, but also didn't dare speak directly. This time, words may not have been spoken, but each time he passed by David and Ethan with a clear and judgmental look. It was like a denial of their importance in his eyes. The way he looked at them seemed to say that their presence in first class was, to him, strange and unworthy. The discomfort spread throughout the cabin, especially for Ethan. He couldn't understand how someone could feel entitled to judge and dismiss another so openly. In his mind, everything was a jumble of resentment and unease, a sense of alienation he couldn't explain. Each story Dr. Schilling told the passengers around him only heightened the tension in the air. He spoke about his accomplishments in his career, about the medical research he was proud of, and the issues in the healthcare world he believed were important. But those words didn't just convey information, they seemed to carry an assertion that those around him, especially those of lower status, didn't deserve the same attention. This feeling made Ethan unable to sit still. He had read about injustice in books, heard stories of people who had suffered racial discrimination, but when faced with it himself, he realized that theory couldn't fill the gap that emotions created. This time, it wasn't an abstract story. He could feel the hurt deep inside, as if a part of him had been diminished and denied simply because of his skin color and social standing. Ethan knew that his father had learned to not let such things weaken his resolve, but he, a young adult, felt as though the entire world was pushing him into a corner. And this feeling grew even more palpable when Dr. Schilling began to openly disrespect Ethan and David. Meanwhile, David, though silent, had begun to change his expression. The subtle signs of fatigue and patience gradually faded. He had faced countless situations like this throughout his life, but this time, seeing his son endure something like this made him unable to remain silent anymore. The years of accumulated patience and life strategies were no longer enough to help him resolve this situation with quietude. And then, everything exploded when Dr. Schilling said something that made all the passengers in the first-class cabin pay attention. "I can't believe it," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "First class is nothing anymore. Sometimes I wonder, are we all pulling each other down to the lowest level? It seems now anyone can get in." This statement hit like a punch to the face, not only for Ethan, but for every passenger in the cabin. Ethan clenched his eyes shut, trying to remain calm, but he knew that no one could pretend not to have heard it. Dr. Schilling's gaze at that moment wasn't just one of contempt for him. It was contempt for everything David had built, for everything father and son represented. And right at that moment, Marcus Harrington made a decision no one expected. "Enough," Marcus said, his voice firm and without fear. Everyone turned to look, and in Marcus' eyes, there was a noticeable change. He was no longer a mild-mannered 17-year-old, but someone ready to face injustice right before his eyes. David looked at his son, his gaze no longer filled with concern, but with pride. He understood that Ethan wasn't just standing up for himself, but for the values they had built together throughout their lives. And in first class, where everything seemed like luxury, this was the moment Marcus would no longer allow anyone to disrespect him or his family. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to change instantly. The passengers around them began to look at each other, no one saying anything, but a tension spreading through the air. Dr. Schilling no longer held his calm demeanor, standing up, but Marcus wouldn't allow him to continue with his disrespectful words. "What right do you have to speak to me like that?" Marcus continued, his tone calm but clear. "Just because you have money and education doesn't mean you can treat others as inferior." A long silence followed. The flight attendants started to tense up, looking at each other, unsure of how to intervene. But no one dared to step into this conversation. Dr. Schilling lowered his head, his eyes filled with shame, but not fully acknowledging his mistake. He didn't respond to Marcus, but simply turned his back and sat down. The silence made everyone in the cabin realize that, sometimes, silence was the only response to an insult. Ethan looked at his father, his eyes full of appreciation. He not only learned from his father how to live strongly, but also how to stand up in moments when everything seemed hopeless. In first class, the stories of everyone else continued, but today, Marcus Harrington's story had written a new chapter. The flight continued to glide through the clouds below, but in the first-class cabin, everything seemed to have changed completely. After the confrontation between Marcus Harrington and Dr. Schilling, the atmosphere on the plane became heavier than ever. Although no one spoke, the tension still covered every corner of the first-class cabin. The feeling among the passengers was no longer one of the usual comfort, but rather a sense of waiting, as if everything was about to explode. Dr. Schilling was no longer the confident, cold man he once was. He sat quietly, his eyes too afraid to look at anyone, though he occasionally shot quick glances at Marcus and David. His arrogance, though not easily erased, had been shaken, and at this moment, it was Marcus' threatening gaze that had made him fall silent. It wasn't because he lacked self-respect, but because he realized that, for the first time, he couldn't find his place in this first-class cabin. David, sitting next to his son, maintained his calm demeanor, but deep inside, a quiet anger seemed to be simmering. He looked at his son with pride for how he had stood up for himself, but he was also more aware than ever of what his son would face in this life. Sometimes his silence and patience were not signs of yielding, but long-term strategies. But this time, when Marcus spoke, silence was not always the best choice. Ethan sat still, the feeling in his chest no longer one of confusion. He sensed the change in the air, not just because of this confrontation, but because he had grown so much. After all, this was just one moment in his life, and he couldn't let it affect him for too long. Dr. Schilling might be a doctor, but the racism he displayed had nothing to do with his talent or education. His perspective had changed. He no longer felt inferior in the eyes of anyone. He had the right to exist in this space, just like the other passengers. And more importantly, he knew that not only he, but also his father, his family, his friends, and the wider society would always be there to support him. However, this confrontation wasn't limited to the exchange of tense glances between Tuman Marcus and Dr. Schilling. Another passenger in the cabin, a middle-aged woman with silver hair, had witnessed everything from the beginning. Her name was Caroline Westfield, a woman distinguished by her elegant appearance and sharp intellect. Unlike most of the passengers in first class, Caroline didn't hesitate to look directly at Dr. Schilling, then turned to look at Marcus and David. Her eyes were not full of judgment, but of a quiet empathy and understanding without words. After a long silence, she spoke, gently lifting her glass of water. "I feel I need to say something," Caroline began, her gaze a mix of sincerity and seriousness. "Not all of us can see the essence of the issue immediately, but I think right now we are witnessing a confrontation that none of us can avoid." Caroline's words caught the attention of everyone in the cabin, including Dr. Schilling. He looked up, his face no longer triumphant as before. All he could do was fall silent, his eyes cast downward. Caroline didn't wait for his response, but continued. We're not just talking about someone being slapped. The important thing is, we are talking about how people like Marcustos who may carry power, career, and success still have to endure racism just because of the color of their skin. Her words hit everyone in the cabin like a wave. Part of them felt guilty for not speaking out against the poor treatment of Marcus. Another part felt anger as they realized that, despite the lack of any overt actions, racism was still lurking somewhere in their lives. David, unable to let such a confrontation continue without resolution, decided to speak up. He sighed, set his glass of water down, then turned to Dr. Schilling with a calculating look. "You think that slap was just a personal insult, but you don't understand that when you did that. You touched something much bigger. This isn't just about me or my son. This is a societal issue." The cabin fell silent. Everyone listened to David's deep words. He wasn't just talking about racism in society. He was posing a bigger question: can human values triumph in a world full of people like Dr. Schilling? Caroline Westfield, sensing the tension rise, stood and gently added, "Fairness isn't just a word, it's an action. And this action, I believe, will be a great lesson for all of us, especially for the younger generation." This dialogue, though simple, was full of implications. It didn't just resolve the conflict between two individuals, but opened a door for Marcus to reassess himself, as well as how he would stand up in the future. He knew that, no matter how life turned out, he would always have to fight against issues like these. But more importantly, he had learned how to face and overcome them not with anger, but with calm, wisdom, and power. The situation didn't just stop at a small conversation in first class. It sparked a revolution in awareness. The passengers on this flight would never look at each other the same way again, and Marcus would certainly lead the way on this journey. Flight 237 continued to glide through the clouds below, but in the first-class cabin, everything seemed to have changed completely. After the confrontation between Marcus Harrington and Dr. Schilling, the atmosphere on the plane became heavier than ever, though no one spoke. The tension still lingered in every corner of the first-class cabin. The passengers didn't say a word, but they could all feel the encounter had opened a gap in their minds. The conflict wasn't just between two individuals, but a reflection of the larger societal issues that many were still trying to avoid. David, sitting silently next to his son, kept his gaze fixed on the window. He knew that this flight wasn't just an ordinary trip. It was an event, a significant milestone in his family's journey. Everything could change after today, and he had prepared himself for that. The passengers around them began to return to their meals and activities, but the atmosphere remained tense. Dr. Schilling, after the shock of the confrontation, had retreated, not daring to speak again. He turned his back to Marcus and David, trying to avoid the wary glances from the other passengers. But at that moment, no one in the cabin could ignore the tension he had created. The flight continued to glide through the white, fluffy clouds, but the first-class cabin sank into an oppressive silence. That discomfort didn't just stem from the confrontation between Marcus and Schilling, but from the recognition of a truth that everyone was trying to ignore. Racism still exists, not only in society, but even in places supposed to be prestigious, like this first-class cabin. Ethan sat quietly, his eyes gazing into the distance. He could feel the change in how people looked at him, though no one said anything. He knew that Caroline Westfield's gaze, or even the glances from the other passengers around him, had changed. He was no longer just an ordinary teenage boy now. He had become a symbol of a confrontation that society couldn't turn a blind eye to. A man like Dr. Schilling, though talented in medicine, lacked the sensitivity to understand people, and he would undoubtedly have to pay the price for his attitude. And David knew this better than anyone. He had spent his life building a strong empire, but he also understood that power, money, and fame weren't always enough to protect his son from the societal prejudices that still existed. "Dad, he'll never change, will he?" Ethan finally spoke, breaking the silence. His question echoed in the cabin, as though he were seeking an answer from his father. David smiled softly and looked at his son. Change doesn't come from people like him. It comes from people like us. We don't need to change them, Ethan. We need to change how we face them. Ethan listened and nodded. He understood now. Dr. Schilling's suspicious glances, the contempt he had to face, were things he would have to learn to live with. But what mattered was that he didn't have to change. He didn't need to mold himself to fit into the world. The world needed to change how it viewed people like him. The silence enveloped the first-class cabin until Caroline Westfield once again broke the atmosphere. She turned to David, her gaze no longer filled with doubt or coldness, but with deep respect. David, I think what we need to do right now isn't retaliation, it's reflection, so that everyone on this flight understands that actions like these cannot be forgiven. We cannot remain silent. David looked at her and nodded. Exactly. Don't let silence become complicity. Caroline's words were a powerful message, not only for Dr. Schilling, but for everyone witnessing this. Sometimes, silence is not the solution. And today, the story wouldn't just end with a personal incident between two men, but would serve as a big reminder to all of us that fairness cannot be built on tolerating wrongdoing. Marcus sat back, reflecting on everything that had just happened. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like he had won. But he felt a certain strength in speaking the truth, in facing issues that society was trying to deny. Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a new generation. For those without power, without a voice, who still had to live under the shadow of prejudice. Suddenly, Captain Chen announced over the intercom, "We will be arriving in San Francisco in 30 minutes. Thank you for choosing to fly with United Airlines." The intercom buzzed, but no one in the first-class cabin could relax. Even though they hadn't directly participated in the events, everyone could feel the shift in the air. Marcus wasn't just facing racism on this flight. He had also witnessed the change in how others viewed him, and this, perhaps, would be the first step in a long journey he would continue. As the plane began its descent, it felt as though everyone was preparing for an important turning point. David looked at his son once more, without needing to say much, just gently placing his hand on his. "Sons, this wasn't just a lesson in patience. It was a lesson in how to face the bigger issues life brings." When the plane touched down and began taxiing on the runway, all the passengers in first class stood up, preparing to disembark. But no one could forget what had happened. They would return to their lives, but Marcus Harrington's story would remain in their minds. This journey didn't just end when they got off the plane. It was a beginning of change, justice, and learning how to stand up against prejudice in society. And the question still lingered, a bigger question. Can we change this world? Or will we only be witnesses to change and do nothing? Flight 237 had landed in San Francisco, marking not just the end of a journey, but also the beginning of a deep confrontation with issues no one could ignore. As Marcus Harrington stepped off the plane with his father, the atmosphere in the airport seemed to fall into silence. The people around them, even though not directly involved in the event, could feel a major change had just occurred in the first-class cabin. Marcus still felt the weight of his breath, and the emotions from the confrontation with Dr. Schilling had yet to fade. But he also realized that the problem wasn't just with him, it was society that needed to change. What he and his father had gone through on this flight was just a small part of a bigger picture of racism and injustice in society. David, seeing the worry and unease in his son's eyes, knew that this flight wouldn't just change Marcus's life, it would also change how he viewed the world. The values David had instilled in his son were no longer just theories, but practical lessons that Marcus had to face right now. David knew that, no matter how talented and successful his son became, these prejudices would always be a part of his life. But what mattered was how Marcus would face them. "Marcus," David said softly as they left the airport, "you did very well. But your journey doesn't end here. Don't let these things throw you off course." Marcus simply nodded, but inside, a fire still burned. He understood clearly that, even though he could return home and continue his studies at MIT, These issues wouldn't disappear. And if he did nothing, if he didn't change his perspective, there would never be any real change. After leaving the airport, they returned to their apartment, where Marcus had spent so much time studying, researching, and preparing for the future. But now, this room had become a place for deep reflection, where he had to confront his thoughts about himself and what had just happened. The unease lingered in his heart, but there was also something new, a powerful sense of justice that was urging him on. At Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Schilling was facing consequences he could never have imagined. Continuous phone calls, urgent meetings, and finally, a meeting with the hospital's executives. They informed him that after thoroughly reviewing the incident on the flight, the hospital would conduct an internal investigation and suspend him from his duties until everything was clarified. But this wasn't the end. The video of his behavior had quickly gone viral on social media, garnering millions of views and thousands of critical comments. The public began to question Dr. Schilling's professionalism and whether someone like him could continue working in the medical field, a place where fairness and respect for humanity should be paramount. The hospital, after reviewing the situation, issued a public statement saying that Dr. Schilling's actions were unacceptable, and they would cooperate with the authorities to handle the case according to the proper procedures. This would not only impact his career, but also tarnish the hospital's image. Those who had once respected and admired Dr. Schilling now had to face a truth they could not deny. He had failed to uphold the dignity and responsibility of a doctor. The theories on science and medicine he had once taught his students could no longer hide the truth about his character. Inside, he felt a great disappointment, a realization that he had lost everything he had built simply because of thoughtless words and actions. In a brief moment, Marcus and David, in the time following the incident, continued to receive support from the community. The video of the incident on Flight 237 not only spread across the media, but also sparked serious discussions about racial issues in modern society. They received messages, letters from all over, thanking Marcus for speaking up and for setting an example for others. However, despite all the support, Marcus didn't feel satisfied. He still felt a void in his heart, a sense that everything wasn't truly over. He didn't just want to see fairness for himself. He wanted to see real change in society, where no one should have to endure racial discrimination simply because of the color of their skin. One day, while Marcus was sitting in his classroom at MIT, an unexpected phone call came through. On the other end was a woman from the Department of Justice, Rachel Dawson. She informed him that the incident involving Dr. Schilling was being reviewed. From a legal perspective, they were considering the possibility of pressing charges against him for racist behavior, a charge that could elevate the case to a criminal level. Rachel explained that, although it was a difficult decision, with the clear evidence from the video, Dr. Schilling's actions were not just a personal mistake. They reflected a larger system where racial discrimination had not been adequately addressed. The Department of Justice was working to build a strong case to not only protect Marcus's rights, but also send a strong message that actions like this would not be tolerated. Marcus listened in silence, then finally spoke. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll think about this. This is a big decision, not just for me, but for my family as well." When the call ended, Marcus sat still in the room, his eyes gazing into the distance. He knew that, no matter where this case went, his life would never be the same again. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for a future generation, for those whose voices had never been heard. And with everything that was happening, Marcus realized that, no matter how life changed, the fight for justice would always be an ongoing battle. Flight 237 had landed in San Francisco, marking not just the end of a journey, but also the beginning of a deep confrontation with issues no one could ignore. When Marcus Harrington stepped off the plane with his father, the atmosphere in the airport seemed to fall into silence. The people around them, even though not directly involved in the event, could feel that a major change had just taken place in the first-class cabin. Marcus still felt the weight of his breath, and the emotions from his confrontation with Dr. Schilling hadn't yet faded. But he also realized that it wasn't just about him. The real issue was society needing to change. What he and his father had experienced on this flight was only a small part of the larger picture of racism and injustice in society. David, seeing the worry and unease in his son's eyes, knew that this flight wouldn't just change Marcus's life. It would also change how he viewed the world. The values David had instilled in his son were no longer just theories, but real lessons that Marcus had to face right now. David knew that, no matter how talented and successful his son became, these prejudices would always be a part of his life. But what mattered was how Marcus would face them. "Marcus," David said softly as they left the airport, "you did very well. But your journey doesn't end here. Don't let these things throw you off course." Marcus simply nodded, but inside, a fire still burned. He understood clearly that, even though he could return home and continue his studies at MIT, these issues wouldn't disappear. And if he did nothing, if he didn't change his perspective, there would never be any real change. After leaving the airport, they returned to their apartment, where Marcus had spent so much time studying, researching, and preparing for the future. But now, this room had become a place for deep reflection, where he had to confront his thoughts about himself and what had just happened. The unease lingered in his heart, but there was also something new, a powerful sense of justice that was urging him on. At Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Schilling was facing consequences he could never have imagined. Continuous phone calls, urgent meetings, and finally, a meeting with the hospital's executives. They informed him that after thoroughly reviewing the incident on the flight, the hospital would conduct an internal investigation and suspend him from his duties until everything was clarified. But this wasn't the end. The video of his behavior had quickly gone viral on social media, garnering millions of views and thousands of critical comments. The public began to question Dr. Schilling's professionalism and whether someone like him could continue working in the medical field, a place where fairness and respect for humanity should be paramount. The hospital, after reviewing the situation, issued a public statement saying that Dr. Schilling's actions were unacceptable, and they would cooperate with the authorities to handle the case according to the proper procedures. This would not only impact his career, but also tarnish the hospital's image. Those who had once respected and admired Dr. Schilling now had to face a truth they could not deny. He had failed to uphold the dignity and responsibility of a doctor. The theories on science and medicine he had once taught his students could no longer hide the truth about his character. Inside, he felt a great disappointment, a realization that he had lost everything he had built simply because of thoughtless words and actions. In a brief moment, Marcus and David, in the time following the incident, continued to receive support from the community. The video of the incident on Flight 237 not only spread across the media, but also sparked serious discussions about racial issues in modern society. They received messages, letters from all over, thanking Marcus for speaking up and for setting an example for others. However, despite all the support, Marcus didn't feel satisfied. He still felt a void in his heart, a sense that everything wasn't truly over. He didn't just want to see fairness for himself, he wanted to see real change in society, where no one should have to endure racial discrimination simply because of the color of their skin. One day, while Marcus was sitting in his classroom at MIT, an unexpected phone call came through. On the other end was a woman from the Department of Justice, Rachel Dawson. She informed him that the incident involving Dr. Schilling was being reviewed. From a legal perspective, they were considering the possibility of pressing charges against him for racist behavior, a charge that could elevate the case to a criminal level. Rachel explained that, although it was a difficult decision, with the clear evidence from the video, Dr. Schilling's actions were not just a personal mistake. They reflected a larger system, where racial discrimination had not been adequately addressed. The Department of Justice was working to build a strong case to not only protect Marcus's rights, but also send a strong message that actions like this would not be tolerated. Marcus listened in silence, then finally spoke. "Thank you, Rachel. I'll think about this. This is a big decision, not just for me, but for my family as well." When the call ended, Marcus sat still in the room, his eyes gazing into the distance. He knew that, no matter where this case went, his life would never be the same again. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for a future generation, for those whose voices had never been heard. And with everything that was happening, Marcus realized that, no matter how life changed, the fight for justice would always be an ongoing battle. Just a week after Marcus made his decision, his life had completely changed. He was no longer just a student at MIT, but also a part of a larger legal battle that anyone in society would have to face when standing up against racism. Although everything could have passed in the shadows of other lawsuits, this case had truly captured the public's attention, and it was the public's interest that gave Marcus strength. On the day the court hearing began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense and silent. Marcus entered the room, accompanied by David, who had been by his side throughout this entire battle. Rachel Dawson, the lawyer representing the Department of Justice, stood beside them, her face betraying the tension she couldn't hide. Today would be the day when justice was put to the test, and every testimony, every piece of evidence, would have a significant impact on the final outcome. Opposite them sat Dr. Schilling, once a prominent figure in the medical field, but now a man heavily criticized by the public. He sat silently in a dark suit, his eyes no longer filled with the smugness they once held. He didn't look at Marcus, didn't look at anyone in the room, but instead stared down at the table, as if not wanting to face what he had done. The judge entered the room, bringing with him a wave of silence. The trial began. "We are here today to hear a serious case involving the racist behavior and physical assault of the defendant, Dr. Walter Schilling, against Marcus Harrington," the judge announced, and immediately, all eyes turned toward Marcus. He felt a little nervous, but as the minutes passed, he became more confident. The trial proceeded with tension mounting by the minute. Rachel Dawson presented the evidence clearly and powerfully. The video capturing Dr. Schilling's behavior in first class on Flight 237 was introduced as evidence, and everyone in the room could clearly see the insult he had caused. The racist remarks, coupled with the violent act of slap to Marcus's face, made many people in the room unable to remain still. "This is not just a personal action," Rachel said in her argument, her gaze resolute. "This is a clear manifestation of prejudice and racism, things that still exist even in educated and powerful people like the defendant. Dr. Schilling's actions didn't just insult Marcus, they reflect a system where racism still exists, and people like Marcus, no matter their talent or power, cannot escape the contempt of people like him." Each of Rachel's words felt like a sharp cut into Dr. Schilling's arrogance, forcing him to face the truth of his actions. But more than that, her words served as a warning to everyone in the room that discriminatory actions don't only happen in the shadows but sometimes appear in the places we think are the safest. When it was David's turn to speak, he wasn't just a father defending his son, but a man standing up against a much larger issue. "We're not standing here just because of an incident that happened on a plane. We're standing here for a fight for justice. What happened to Marcus is something that anyone in this room can understand, it just as an insult, but as the denial of a person's dignity simply because of the color of their skin." David wasn't just speaking for Marcus, but also for all those who had suffered discrimination in society. He didn't use emotional words, but strong reasoning to point out that, no matter how the world changes, these prejudices must be eradicated. On the other side, Dr. Schilling remains silent, offering no rebuttal. Sometimes, silence can say more than any defense. His silence was not just an admission, but also a resignation from a man who had once believed that power and education could shield him from any consequences. The trial lasted all day, and evidence from both sides was presented. But the key point of the trial wasn't just Dr. Schilling's actions, it was a large lesson about how society perceives racism. and the changes that need to be made to ensure that such incidents don't happen again. Finally, the judge spoke after reviewing all the evidence. After considering all the evidence and testimonies, I declare that Dr. Walter Schilling engaged in racist behavior and assaulted Marcus Harrington. This behavior is unacceptable in modern society. The court will issue a sentence after considering the appropriate penalties. As the trial concluded, everyone left the courtroom, but no one could forget what had transpired over the course of the day. Marcus, though unable to feel a complete victory, knew that he had done the right thing. People like Dr. Schilling wouldn't change easily, but at least he had made society take a hard look and confront the larger issues that had long been ignored. David looked at his son, his gaze filled with pride. You did well, Marcus, not because you won, but because you stood up against what was wrong. Marcus looked at his father, then at the long hallway ahead of them. He knew that, although this trial had ended, his journey was far from over. He would continue fighting for justice, for those without a voice, and for a future where everyone, regardless of their skin color, could be treated equally. Thank you, Dad, Marcus said, his voice soft, but filled with determination. I won't stop here. I will keep fighting, and in his heart, he knew that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one where justice would no longer be something distant, but an essential part of society. The lawsuit over Flight to 37 was no longer just a significant event in the life of Marcus Harrington and his family. It had become a turning point in the fight against racism and injustice in society. No matter the final outcome, Marcus knew he had done something important. He had stood up, spoken out, and confronted the larger issues that no one could ignore. And this not only changed him, but also changed how people viewed racism in modern society. That day, after the trial, David Harrington and Marcus returned to their apartment in San Francisco. Everything, from the city's light to the atmosphere around them, felt different. Even though they had achieved a partial victory in the trial, the air was still heavy, not because of a sense of defeat, but because of the deep realization that this fight was far from over. Marcus sat down at his desk, his eyes focused on the unfinished documents in front of him. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Although the lawsuit had achieved a result, he still felt something was missing. A sense of dissatisfaction, not because of the slap or the racist remarks, but because he understood that real change could only come when each person in society began to take responsibility for addressing this issue. Marcus thought about Dr. Schilling. Although he had been suspended and was facing consequences for his actions, was that truly a just outcome, or was it just a part of a system that still enabled racism? Schilling would face personal consequences, but would the hospital system, the medical field, and society truly learn anything from this incident? Marcus understood that, even though this lawsuit had caused a great deal of every day, on top of that, Marcus couldn't help but think of the passengers on Flight to 37, those who witnessed the event, but did not intervene. He didn't want to blame them, but for a moment, they stood still, and that was something he couldn't easily overlook. Sometimes, silence is a form of complicity. Marcus was keenly aware that not everyone in the first-class cabin spoke up, but those who didn't speak were the ones who created the space for actions like Schilling's to occur. One question echoed in Marcus's mind. How do we stop those moments of silence? Meanwhile, David also continued to think about the future. He knew that with his power and reputation, he could influence many people. But he also recognized that change wouldn't come just from people like him, but from ordinary people, those living in this world every day and continuously fighting for justice. That evening, as they sat down to dinner together, Marcus decided to share an important thought with his father. Dad, I don't know what to do next. I can't just stop here, right? We need to do something bigger, something that really changes everything. David looked at his son, his face showing neither worry nor doubt. He knew that one day Marcus would face these questions. He knew his son wouldn't stop, and that was what made him proud. You don't need to know all the answers right now, Marcus. Yes, we can do more, But remember, every step forward, no matter how small, matters. Marcus's perspective changed in that moment. He realized that instead of looking for an immediate grand answer, he needed to start with the small things. That was the way to create lasting change. He could start by making his world fairer, not just for people like him, but for everyone who suffers from discrimination. Marcus realized that his actions could inspire others, and that was a power he needed to harness. The next day, Marcus and David decided to meet with Rachel Dawson. They wanted to discuss the next steps, not only in the legal fight, but also in how to create lasting change. "We can't just end with one lawsuit," Marcus said to Rachel when they sat down together. "I want to go further. I want to fight to change the system, not just individuals. How do we make sure people like Schilling can no longer exist in a system they think is safe?" Rachel looked at Marcus with deep respect. "Marcus, that's an important question. And I believe that if you keep fighting like this, you will be the leader of a larger movement. But to do that, you'll need the support of many more people." Marcus sat quietly, his eyes shining with new determination. He knew that fighting for justice wasn't just his personal battle, it was society's battle. He would face many challenges, but he also realized that this was a journey he was ready to take. He wouldn't let things pass by in vain. Finally, when they left Rachel's office, Marcus didn't feel burdened. He felt relieved, as if he had found a new path. He wasn't just fighting for his own rights, but for those forgotten in the shadows. And most importantly, he had found a way to turn pain into motivation. "Dad, I think I know what I need to do next," Marcus said, his voice confident, but filled with patience. "I will continue fighting, but this time not just with words. I will fight with action. I will do everything I can to create a fairer world." David smiled, gently patting his son's shoulder. "Yes, son, never stop. Because when you don't stop, the world won't be able to stop either." And Marcus knew that, no matter how difficult this journey might be, he would never be alone. Because change starts with small steps, and once one person stands up, others will follow. After the trial, Marcus Harrington and his family's life was no longer as peaceful as it had been before. The conclusion of a legal battle was not just a personal victory, but a symbol of the ongoing struggles of those forgotten in society. And although Dr. Schilling had faced the consequences of his actions, both Marcus and David understood that justice doesn't only come from court rulings. True justice will only come when society changes, when everyone understands that racism is not something that can be accepted under any circumstances. Since the trial, Marcus had become a familiar face in conversations about social justice and racism. But he also understood that change could not come from one individual or one lawsuit. It needed to be nurtured from small actions, from the everyday decisions that each person makes. At the beginning of the following month, Marcus accepted an invitation to attend a seminar on equity in education at MIT, where he would share his story with leaders, scholars, and students from around the world. This wasn't only an opportunity for Marcus to bring his voice to a larger community, but also an opportunity for him to better understand the challenges others face. What Marcus hadn't expected was that, throughout the seminar, he wouldn't just be sharing his story, but would also hear many stories from others, from those who had been fighting racism in different fields. One of the stories Marcus remembered most was from Dr. Julia Patel, a black doctor who had fought against prejudice in the medical field for many years. Dr. Patel shared that, when she first started her career, she was frequently denied opportunities for advancement simply because of her skin color. Despite having qualifications, experience, and being highly regarded in her field, she still faced unnecessary doubts from her colleagues. This not only hurt me personally, but it also harmed the healthcare system, a place where I've poured all my passion and dedication, Dr. Patel said during the conversation. "I'm not just fighting for myself, but for all the patients I could help if given the opportunity. So I can't let this discrimination stop me." Dr. Patel's story made Marcus realize something important. He wasn't just the one being discriminated against. he could also be the one to change the game. Change doesn't come from waiting for someone to do something big, but from consistent steps, from the efforts to change from within each individual. He understood that life would never be easy, and everyone would face challenges. But if we know how to confront them, nothing is impossible. After the seminar, Marcus decided to continue learning and participating in projects that advocated for the rights of those who face discrimination. He began to get involved in charitable organizations, scholarship funds for students of color, especially in fields where they had fewer opportunities to join. Marcus also started working with community organizations to help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds gain opportunities to learn, develop, and overcome social barriers. A year later, when he looked back at the journey he had been on, Marcus no longer felt like a vulnerable teenager. Instead, he saw himself as a fighter, fighting not just for himself but for others. He had joined many campaigns, supported efforts to eliminate racism, and he had begun to notice a shift in how the community perceived this issue. One evening, during a meeting with leaders from the organization Marcus was part of, one of his colleagues, Caroline Westfield, said something that Marcus would remember forever. "I used to think that fairness was just a distant concept. But today, looking at what you've done, I realize that fairness isn't something we just dream about. Fairness is something we build from the smallest actions, from the decisions we make every day." That statement made Marcus think a lot. He realized that, even though change doesn't come easily, if each person plays their part, together we can create a fairer world. Marcus hadn't just stood up for himself, but for those without a voice, for those who can't speak for themselves, for those who endure discrimination every day and don't know how to change it. Now, looking back, Marcus realized that the story of Flight to 37 wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. He had risen from the challenges, overcome difficulties, and more importantly, had helped spark a larger dialogue about fairness and rights in society. He was no longer just a victim of discrimination, but someone who created change. For Marcus Harrington, his journey had just begun. He knew there was still much to be done, many challenges to face, but he also knew that this path wasn't one he walked alone. With his family, friends, and comrades, Marcus would continue to fight, not just for himself but for a fair society, where no one has to endure discrimination just because of their skin color. And one day, future generations will look back at the story of Marcus Harrington and realize that it was people like him who changed society,